The untold story of the French Revolution. Imagine a world, not so long ago, where kings and queens lived like gods, sparkling in gold while their people starved. Picture Paris, a city of grand palaces and hungry faces, ready to explode. What if I told you the story you know about the French Revolution is missing some truly wild, hidden truth? It was the summer of 1789. The air in Paris was thick and heavy, not just with the summer heat, but with a different kind of pressure. The common people, the farmers, the bakers, the shoemakers, were tired. Their stomachs grumbled with hunger, while King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette held fancy parties, eating sweet cakes and drinking fine wine at the Palace of Versailles. The palace was huge, like a city itself, miles away from the dirty streets of Paris, shining with gold and fancy mirrors. Marie Antoinette, with her tall, powdered hair, loved expensive dresses and jewels. She bought new shoes every week, while children in Paris wore torn clothes and had no shoes at all. The poor people worked hard, but most of their money went to taxes. These taxes paid for the king's wars and the queen's parties. They paid for a life of luxury for the nobles, people born into rich families. The common people, who made up almost everyone, had very little say in anything. They felt like they were invisible, like their lives didn't matter. But something was changing. Whispers grew louder in the marketplaces, in the dark corners of coffee houses, and even in the quiet bakeries before dawn. People were talking about freedom and equality. They wanted to be treated fairly. They wanted a voice. These ideas were like tiny sparks, flying through the dry hay, ready to catch fire. One young man, a baker's son named Antoine, felt this fire deep in his chest. Antoine wasn't like the other young men who just complained. He read books, smuggled in from other countries, that talked about new ways of thinking. He worked long hours in his father's hot, flour-dusted bakery, kneading dough, but his mind was always buzzing. He dreamed of a different France, a place where his little sister, Elise, wouldn't have to go to bed hungry. Elise was only 8, with bright, curious eyes, but her small hands were already calloused from helping around their small, dark home. Antoine often met with a small group of friends in the hidden back room of a small, dusty bookstore. The bookseller, an old man with kind eyes named Monsieur Dubois, pretended not to notice their hushed, urgent talk. Dubois believed in a better future too. He would slide them pamphlets, thin papers printed with brave, new ideas, hidden between heavy history books. These pamphlets were like secret messages, telling people to wake up, to stand up. "We need more than whispers," Antoine once said, his voice low but firm, as he gripped a crumpled pamphlet. "We need action. The king will never listen to our pleas. He lives too far away, in his golden cage." His friend, a blacksmith's apprentice named Jean-Luc, nodded. Jean-Luc had strong arms, used to hammering hot metal, and a quick temper. He believed in fighting for what was right. The summer grew hotter. Prices for bread, the most important food for the poor, kept climbing. One day, Antoine saw a woman crying in the market. She held a tiny, limp baby in her arms. She had no money for bread, and her baby was starving. This image burned into Antoine's mind. It was a sign. Enough was enough. Then came the shocking news. The king fired Jacques Necker, a minister who was popular with the common people. Necker had tried to help, tried to make things a little fairer. Firing him was like a slap in the face to everyone who hoped for change. This news flew through Paris like a wildfire. People poured into the streets. They gathered in huge crowds, shouting, angry, their voices echoing off the old stone buildings. On July 14, 1789, a day that would change the world forever, the anger exploded. The common people, armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, old swords, even kitchen knives, stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a giant, scary prison, a symbol of the king's power and his ability to lock away anyone he didn't like. It was a dark, towering fortress that looked impossible to break. Antoine was there, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He saw Jean-Luc, yelling, pushing forward. The air filled with shouts, the smell of gunpowder, and the fear, but also a thrilling kind of hope. It was chaos, a messy, wild fight. The guards inside the Bastille fired their cannons, but the people kept coming. They were too many, and they were too angry to stop. Finally, after hours of fighting, the gates of the Bastille fell. The prisoners inside, only a few of them, were freed. It wasn't the number of prisoners that mattered, but what the Bastille represented. Its fall showed that the king was not all-powerful. It showed that the people, when they stood together, could do amazing things. This moment, this loud, messy victory, was the real beginning of the French Revolution. But here's the secret, the untold part. While the main story talks about the Bastille, something else was stirring in the shadows, something much more organized than angry mobs. A secret society, known only as the Silent Weavers, had been working for years, planting seeds of revolution. They were not just common people. Some were even disguised nobles, unhappy with the way things were, but afraid to show their true faces. The Silent Weavers didn't use swords or guns. They used words, ideas, and carefully placed stories. They funded the secret printing of those pamphlets Antoine read. They paid messengers to carry news of the king's lavish spending to the farthest corners of France. They even spread rumors about the queen, knowing that if people hated her enough, they would turn against the entire royal family. Antoine, unknowingly, was one of their most effective tools. His passion, his ability to speak to others, made him a natural leader in his small community. The Silent Weavers had watched him for months, noticed how he rallied people, how he made them believe. They never approached him directly, but they made sure the most powerful pamphlets ended up in Monsieur Dubois's bookstore, knowing Antoine would find them. They even made sure a certain baker, struggling more than most, got a small, anonymous loan, just enough to keep his family fed and his son, Antoine, free to focus on bigger ideas. After the Bastille fell, the revolution spread like wildfire. The king and queen were practically prisoners in their own palace, forced to move from Versailles to Paris, to live among the very people who now openly defied them. They were placed in the Tuileries Palace, closer to the angry crowds, a constant reminder of their lost power. The grand halls of the Tuileries, once filled with laughter and music, now felt cold and empty, echoing with the sounds of the city's unrest. Antoine, still unaware of the Silent Weavers, felt a surge of pride. He truly believed it was the people's power alone that had driven this change. He became more active, speaking at public meetings, his voice hoarse from shouting for justice. He saw his little sister, Elise, now carrying her own small flag, cheering alongside the crowds. Her eyes, once full of a child's simple hope for bread, now shone with a fierce, revolutionary spirit. But with victory came new problems. Different groups, all wanting their own kind of freedom, started to argue. Some wanted a king, but with less power. Others wanted no king at all, a republic where the people voted for their leaders. The fight for freedom turned into a fight for power. It was during this time that Antoine met a mysterious woman named Sylvie. She often appeared at the meetings he spoke at, always in the back, listening quietly. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. One evening, after a particularly heated debate, Sylvie approached Antoine. "Your words move people, Antoine," she said, her voice soft but clear, like a cool stream. "But passion alone cannot build a new world. It takes careful hands, like a weaver making a strong cloth." Antoine was surprised. He hadn't noticed her before. "And what kind of hands do you have, mademoiselle?" he asked, a little suspicious. Sylvie smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I help guide those hands. I know people who see the bigger picture, who understand that true change isn't just about breaking down, but about building up, brick by careful brick." Over the next few weeks, Sylvie became Antoine's quiet mentor. She gave him books on how other countries ran their governments, how laws were made. She introduced him to other thinkers, people who spoke not just of anger, but of plans. She subtly steered him away from the most radical, violent ideas, and towards a vision of a more orderly, fair society. She never asked him to join any group, never spoke of the Silent Weavers. She just helped Antoine think more deeply, more strategically. She was, in fact, a key member of the Silent Weavers, tasked with finding and guiding promising young leaders. The king, in a desperate move, tried to escape Paris with his family in June 1791. They dressed in simple clothes, hoping to sneak out of the city and get help from other kings in other countries. But they were recognized. A sharp-eyed postmaster, who had seen the king's face on coins and knew the distinctive royal coach, stopped them in a small town called Varennes. The royal family was brought back to Paris, like captured prizes. Their escape attempt made the people lose all trust in them. It sealed their fate. The country was falling apart. Food was still scarce, and prices were still too high. The king's brothers, who had fled to other countries, started gathering armies to fight against the revolution. France was surrounded by enemies, both inside and outside its borders. The air of hope began to curdle into fear and suspicion. Antoine, now more aware of the complexities of power, saw the fear growing. He saw friends turn on each other, accusing anyone who disagreed with them of being an enemy of the revolution. He saw the newspapers, once filled with brave calls for freedom, now full of angry demands for blood. Sylvie watched him, her quiet presence a steady anchor. "The loom is shaking, Antoine," she warned him one evening, her eyes grave. "The threads are getting tangled. We must work quickly to weave something strong before it all breaks apart." In 1792, France declared itself a republic. No more king, no more queen. The people, through their elected leaders, would rule. It was a huge, exciting moment. But then came the terrible decision, what to do with the king. After a long, angry trial, King Louis XVI was found guilty of treason, of working against his own country. On a cold morning in January 1793, Antoine stood in a huge crowd. He held Elise's hand tightly. A giant wooden machine, the guillotine, stood in the public square. It was a new invention, designed to cut heads off quickly and humanely. The king, once so powerful, was led to it. The crowd was silent, then a roar went up as the blade fell. It was a terrifying, absolute end to 1,000 years of kings in France. Just months later, Marie Antoinette followed him to the same fate. Her beautiful, expensive dresses were replaced by plain, worn clothes. Her tall, powdered hair was cut short. She too faced the blade, and the crowd roared again. The old world was truly gone. But the revolution didn't stop there. The fear that had been growing now exploded into something truly dark, the Reign of Terror. A new government group, led by a powerful speaker named Maximilien Robespierre, believed that to protect the revolution, they had to destroy all its enemies. And they saw enemies everywhere. People were arrested for the smallest things, for complaining about bread, for speaking fondly of the king, even for just looking suspicious. The guillotine worked overtime. Every day, people were dragged through the streets of Paris, their faces pale with fear, on their way to the blade. The streets often ran red. The smell of fear and blood hung heavy in the air. Antoine felt a deep chill. This wasn't the freedom he had dreamed of. This wasn't the equality he had fought for. He saw good people, people who had truly believed in the revolution, being accused and killed. He saw Jean-Luc, his fiery friend, changed. Jean-Luc became a part of the people's army, always ready to shout down anyone who seemed less than fully committed to Robespierre's vision. Jean-Luc's eyes, once full of a simple, honest anger, now had a cold, almost fanatical gleam. Sylvie suddenly became very scarce. Antoine didn't see her at the meetings anymore. He worried about her, about everyone. He knew the silent weavers, whatever they were, must be in great danger. Anyone who worked in the shadows, anyone who thought differently, was a target. One evening, Antoine found a small, rolled-up piece of parchment tucked under the counter in his father's bakery. It was a tiny, faded image of a spindle and thread, the secret symbol of the silent weavers. Beneath it, a single word, Bois. Antoine knew Bois was an old, unused shed, deep in the woods outside the city, where he used to play as a child. It was a place no one would think to look. He went that night, heart pounding. The moon was a sliver, making the woods dark and spooky. The shed was falling apart, its wooden walls creaking in the wind. Inside, a small lantern cast flickering shadows. Sylvie was there, along with Monsieur Dubois, the old bookseller, and several others Antoine vaguely recognized from the early days of the revolution. Quiet, thoughtful people who hadn't joined the angry mobs. Antoine, Sylvie whispered, her face tired but resolute. The loom has become a weapon. Robespierre has gone too far. He is destroying the very spirit of what we built. But what can we do? Antoine asked, his voice raw. He has everyone scared. He has the army, the people. Monsieur Dubois, his kind eyes now filled with a deep sadness, spoke. We created this monster, in a way. We gave people the taste of power. Now we must guide them to use it wisely, not to destroy themselves. He revealed that the silent weavers had been behind many of the early pushes for revolution, but they had never wanted this bloodshed. They had wanted a fair France, not a blood-soaked one. We hoped that once the monarchy was gone, people would build a fair system, Sylvie explained. But Robespierre used the fear of outside enemies to take all the power for himself. He twisted our dreams into a nightmare. The silent weavers had been working in even deeper secrecy, planting doubts about Robespierre among the very people who supported him. They spread subtle messages through trusted channels, making people question if this constant killing was truly what the revolution was about. They highlighted Robespierre's growing ambition, his coldness, his power over life and death. They had one last, desperate plan. Robespierre was scheduled to give a major speech to the National Convention, the governing body, in just a few days. He was expected to name more enemies of the revolution, more people to send to the guillotine. The silent weavers planned to disrupt this speech, to turn the very people who followed him against him. It was incredibly dangerous. If they failed, they would all face the blade. Antoine volunteered immediately. He understood now. The revolution wasn't just about fighting the king, it was about fighting for the right kind of freedom, for a country built on justice, not fear. He had to help stop the terror. He had to save his sister, his city, from this madness. The day of Robespierre's speech arrived. The air in the convention hall was tense, thick with fear. Robespierre stood before the assembly, his face grim, his voice sharp and unyielding. He began to list his perceived enemies, his words cutting like knives. He spoke of purifying France, of removing all traitors. But as he spoke, a murmur started. It was subtle at first, just a few coughs, a few whispers. Then, one of the silent weavers, a quiet woman named Madame Dupont who sat in the middle of the assembly, suddenly stood up. "Who are these enemies, Robespierre?" she cried out, her voice surprisingly strong. "Are we all enemies if we question you?" Others, placed strategically by the silent weavers, began to join in. "You speak of freedom, but you bring only fear," shouted another man, one of the printers Antoine knew. The murmurs grew into shouts. People who had been too afraid to speak now found their courage, emboldened by the small, brave acts around them. They had been primed by the secret whispers and doubts spread by the silent weavers. Robespierre, usually so composed, faltered. He was not used to being questioned. He tried to shout over them, to regain control, but it was too late. The dam of fear had broken. The anger of the people, once aimed at the king, then turned into terror, was now finally turning on the man who wielded the guillotine. Antoine, watching from the public gallery, saw Jean-Luc, his old friend, standing near the front. Jean-Luc looked confused, then horrified, as he saw the mood turn against Robespierre. The fervent belief in Robespierre's absolute righteousness, which the silent weavers had slowly chipped away at, finally crumbled in Jean-Luc's eyes. "Tyrant!" someone screamed. "Down with the tyrant!" The shouts grew louder and louder. Robespierre was arrested right there, in the middle of his speech. The man who had sent so many to the guillotine was now facing the same fate. Just a day later, Robespierre himself was taken to the guillotine. Antoine watched, not with joy, but with a somber understanding. The revolution had eaten its own children, just as Sylvie had warned. The streets were still full of people, but this time, the cheers felt different. There was relief, yes, but also a deep weariness, a sense of having passed through a terrible storm. After Robespierre's fall, the reign of terror slowly faded. The silent weavers, their work done, mostly disappeared back into their lives, never taking credit, never seeking power. They had used their silent influence to guide the course of history, to push the revolution towards a slightly less bloody, more just path. They knew that true change often happens not in the loud shouts of the crowd, but in the quiet, careful actions of a few. Antoine, now older and wiser, continued to work for a better France. He became involved in building new laws, ensuring that no single person could ever hold such terrifying power again. He understood that freedom was not just about throwing off chains, but about building something new and strong in its place. He thought of Sylvie, who had vanished completely, her task fulfilled. He knew her lessons, the ones about careful weaving and not just tearing down, would stay with him forever. Elise grew up in this new, changing France. She never forgot the hunger, the fear, or the hope of those early days. She carried the memory of the revolution, not as a story of simple heroes and villains, but as a complex tale of people trying to find their way, making terrible mistakes, but ultimately striving for a better world. The untold truth was that while the roar of the crowds changed everything, it was the quiet, hidden threads of the silent weavers that ultimately prevented the revolution from completely tearing itself apart. The French Revolution was a fire, but it was also a careful, sometimes desperate, act of weaving, trying to create a new fabric for a nation from the ashes of the old.